Hey, everybody. How are you? It's Tony Penn, Results-Driven Leadership. And what are we going to talk about today? What are we going to communicate today? How about, let's talk about effective communication, as long as we're on the subject. And communication in this day and age takes on so many different forms that it gets actually confusing sometimes to really determine if we're communicating effectively or not. There's a lot happening in the world today, and information comes at you from so many different angles that when there is a level of communication, you have to really ask yourself, well, how effective is it? And am I getting the results that I'm looking for from these various forms of communication? When you're in business in a leadership position, it's critical that you're communicating effectively. Not that you're communicating, but that you're communicating effectively. And it's the same anywhere, not just in business, in relationships as well. You hear it all the time, where relationships fail because there isn't either enough communication or the communication breaks down in various areas. And ultimately, it's not effective. And so for me, it's always been about, I can think that I'm communicating effectively, but am I achieving the desired result? Which is, of course, what we're all about at Results-Driven Leadership, is anything that we do, any process that we have in place, does it lead to the result that we're looking for? And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk a little bit about communication, the need for it, some key tips for communicating effectively, and some key tips for ensuring that there is comprehension and understanding. Most people, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, don't understand who they are when they communicate and how they're perceived, and they don't understand who they're talking to. And that becomes a very important part of this. So, and the other thing that happens all the time, and everybody does it, and I do it a lot, is I will communicate, and in my brain, it is extremely clear what's coming out of my mouth. And so my initial understanding and perception is that it's going to be understood and I will get the results that I'm looking for. But that doesn't happen all the time, because what comes out of your brain and through your mouth isn't necessarily clear as you think it is. And a lot of times you're not in touch with who you're talking to. And so you don't adjust your style or how you communicate to those individuals. So we're going to try to get a practical approach to communication. It's not like we're going to solve all your communication issues, but we are going to come up with some ideas and some thoughts on what you can do to get better results. How's that? Like we talked about, we think we're communicating when we aren't. We think we're being understood when we're not. And what's behind a lot of that? So we're going to try to come up with some strategies, and hopefully this will be helpful to you. There's no one step to ensuring effective communication. There's a lot of things that are involved, but there are some simple, practical ideas and strategies that you can put into place to give yourself a good shot. Let's put it that way. So we've kind of listed 6 elements of effective communication that we're going to talk a little bit about. Building trusting two-way communications, because ultimately there has to be a level of trust for there to be a level of the appropriate level of comprehension. To be able to have dialogue and not monologue, because a lot of times when we're in positions of leadership, we think that we should be the one dictating and directing most of the communication when that's not the case. We'll talk a little bit about how to critique others and provide feedback, I think is a better way to put it. And then creating those channels that provide opportunities to communicate based on everything that we've learned going into that. So once we kind of feel comfortable with how to communicate and how to get comprehension, then what are the channels that we're going to communicate? And then lastly, we're going to talk about effective team meetings. We've attached a couple videos to this one where we talk in detail about how to conduct an effective meeting. So be looking for that. So before we get started, let's think about a time, that you thought about a message that's been communicated effectively, like we discussed. And then you realize, you didn't get through to them at all. And that could be something at work, something at home, whatever the case may be. I just had a scenario recently where one of my clients who owns a restaurant, she was having trouble getting through to her chef, to their kitchen manager. So, because I'm a third party, objective individual who doesn't know them, and I have a level of expertise in the restaurant world, we thought it'd be a good idea if I communicated and I had a conversation with him. So we sat down, and he doesn't speak very good English, and I speak, kitchen, we call it kitchen Spanish. So my Spanish isn't that great, but I think I'm communicating effectively. I'm using English and Spanish. I'm busting out, 30 plus years of knowledge. And I'm looking at this individual, and he's smiling, engaged, shaking his head. I'm doing all the things that we're going to talk about in this module. And we're done, and I go back to the owner, and I was like, yeah, things went really well. I think we had a good rapport, and I think there's a good understanding of some of the things, some of the challenges that he has. And some good strategy to go forward. Cut to, a week later, I'm checking in with her, and how are things going? And she goes, well, things are getting better. But he did kind of let on that he didn't understand a lot of what you were saying. And I think she was referring to the fact that there was a language barrier, while at the same time, I'm thinking, my Spanish is working, when it clearly wasn't. And I don't think I have to, I think as we start to get through this, I don't think I asked enough questions to ensure that there was comprehension. And I think that's where I failed. So think about something that you've gone through and try to figure out, hey, what happened, and try to apply what we learned here to some of those things that occurred during that situation. So the first element is you got to build trust, right? It's easier said than done. Most of the time, like I said, we think we're communicating, but we're really communicating in one direction. We're actually giving direction to people that work for us, with us, whatever the case may be. So there has to be a situation where we are understanding of what two-way communication actually is. Because without it, the results aren't going to get there. There's just no way. If you think that your dictation is going to provide a sustainable, long-lasting result, you're probably kidding yourself. So it's important that this process creates trust. So they have to trust in a lot of different ways. You have to It's not going to happen the first time you sit down with somebody, but you have to be able as a leader to create that environment of trust, things that we talk about in other training sessions. Because without that, you're never going to get that level of understanding and comprehension and engagement. If I don't feel like I'm part of the process, part of the conversation, and I'm just being dictated to, then I'm not going to really understand. And it's not going to have sustain. It might work for a couple of weeks, which is pretty common, where people get motivated based on what they hear. But if they don't feel engaged and part of that process and very clear as to what the expectations are, it doesn't last very long. Then you're kind of back to square one again. So 2 key best practices. Verify that the message that you're sending is the one being received, and then take your personality into it and your communication style. Because one of the things that has to happen is there has to be a connection. You have to have a real human connection with somebody in order for them to really understand messaging. And that's why it's such an important part. It's so important to be able to know another human being, whether they work for you or live with you or work with you, or they're your boss or whatever the case may be. You have to know a human being in order to understand the best way to communicate and for them to feel confident that they can share what they need to share to be able to get the results that you're looking for. And one way to do that is to understand their personality and their tendencies. We use DISC, D-I-S-C, which a lot of people are familiar with, which kind of outlines what people's personality / tendencies are. The high D, very dominant. Let's get to the point. Let's make it happen. Let's go. Let's go. The high I is somebody that is very influential and likes to communicate and is a good communicator and is very personable, generally speaking. You got the S, who's just like very steady and stable and likes status quo, likes things, doesn't like confrontation. And then the C, who's very analytical and compliant, and things got to be kind of in a box for them and explained and talked out in a logical manner. So when you have these different tendencies communicating to each other, it's important that you understand what that is. If you're a high D talking to a high C, you realize that you can't just demand, even though that high C is going to shake their head, generally, got it, write it down, but they're not going to really understand it because it's just not broken down enough for them. So you understand that you have to shift your tendency as that dominant individual to be able to adapt to that individual's style. And I can't stress that enough throughout the course of this, is how important adaptation is as a leader. Because the best leaders in the world adapt their style to the individual that they're trying to get results from. And if you're not capable of doing that, or if you don't think it's necessary, everybody's capable of doing it, by the way. But if you don't think it's important enough, then it's going to be a long, hard road for you. So, then of course, the whole concept of comprehension. Be sure that it's understood. How are you going to be able to make sure that you're understood? Asking a lot of questions is one way. And clarity of messages is another. So clear communication comes from comprehension. So, and results in comprehension. So it's very important to ask specific questions to ensure that people understand you. Why? I think, you can never be too specific or too direct to ensure comprehension, but it's important that you're presenting things in a concise manner, you're breaking it down, and you're testing and paraphrasing, whatever the case may be, to ensure that you are understood. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through there. And like I said, there's some easy ways to confirm. Asking questions. Tell me what you think about what we just talked about. And what are you going to do about it? And here's the other part that we seem to struggle with as leaders, is hearing the person out at length before attempting to end that particular discussion. Because a lot of times along the way, you'll find out what the comprehension is, and more importantly, you'll get some great feedback and some great ideas from it. But that's never going to happen if you're not listening. And I think that comes up a couple times in this module, which is your ability to effectively listen. Because it's one thing to say you're listening, but it's another to actually create an environment where it's very obvious that you're listening. And we'll talk about that in a minute. One of the things beyond just asking questions is being in that moment and being focused in that moment, because there is a tendency for your mind to wander a bit when you're talking to somebody, especially if you're talking to somebody that you're trying to let get through it and they're kind of rambling on and on. So you have to be very careful about staying in the moment and being focused. And eye contact, that's extremely important. Because if people don't think you're listening, they're checking out. They might finish their thought, but they're going to lack engagement. Now, there might be situations where you have to move people along a little bit because they are straying off topic. And it's very easy to say, all right, well, let's stay on topic. Let's get back to what we're talking about specifically. And when you're communicating, you don't want to use phrases like, you know what I mean, even though it's just a common part of the English language, but it often turns out that they have no idea what you meant. Because remember, you're always going to be in a scenario where your employees are going to tend to agree with you, because that's what employees do. Because that's the way they've been wired most of their life, is when the boss says something, I agree. I shake my head and I say, yes, sir. And I've been in so many different scenarios. When I was coming up as in management in the restaurant industry, I had bosses that were extremely loud and emotional. And my response when they were communicating to me early on was, yes, sir. What I did learn from that as time went on was that didn't necessarily get the result that I was looking for. I didn't really understand what was expected of me, and I didn't really agree. And I thought that there has to be a way I can express my views. And that's a whole nother training module on how to deal with situations like that. But understand that you can't assume that people understand what you mean, even though it's clear to you. We talked a little bit about the DISC too, and adapting your message to their style. And it's important that your communication style, you're not overly adapting, so that if you're dealing with someone that very cautious and careful and is a high S and very afraid of confrontation, that you're not going to communicate at all, even though you're the kind of person that really wants to. There is a real balance here. And something I would throw in here is the importance of knowing your people as human beings, not as people that work in your business, because that's going to have a huge impact on that, being able to create a level of trust to where you don't have to walk on eggshells when you're communicating, or you don't have to, bury somebody with your comments as well. So it's important, and I'm telling you this from experience in leading small and large companies, is that I had to get to know who my people were. And once I was able to comfortably understand who they were outside of the job, it was easier to gain that trust. If people understand that you care, they're going to be much more open to different types of messaging style. And once people understood that once they understand that you care, they'll be much willing to perform and be motivated to perform various tasks openly. I can't stress it enough. There's a lot of ways to get to know people, whether it's going out to lunch or team building or anything you can do to create an environment where people feel like they know each other and feel like people care. And then, of course, now that you've kind of established what those, what those strategies are, and you're feeling like you're communicating, and you're feeling like you're asking the pertinent questions, and you're feeling like you're building that level of trust, you got to be consistent. Because we can all talk about going to that meeting where everybody's fired up and jumping up and down, or going to that seminar where you got a motivational speaker, or anything where there's some level of communication that's working. You got to be consistent, and you got to do it all the time. And it's got to become part of the culture within your organization. Whenever you're dealing with that person or the group as a whole, because people can see right through it. They can see right through somebody that's just excited in the moment versus, hey, this is how it is here. Our company, we communicate, we listen to each other, we dialogue, we celebrate. All of these things that we do happen all the time. And when it doesn't happen, then it becomes a big deal, and everybody kind of gathers together and goes, hey, what happened? As opposed to the other way around, which is, oh, wow, look, everybody's fired up today. Can't wait till we go back to, our normal routine where nobody communicates effectively, or I'm being dictated to, or whatever. So practice, consistency is how this works. All right, we'll take a couple minutes here, relax, stretch. And when we come back, we'll talk about some of the barriers that we find to creating that level of dialogue that we're looking for. Talk to you in a minute.